to ureters and bladder. The ureters carry urine from the renal pelvis to the bladder, located behind the pelvic bowl in the lower pelvis. Và các huyết quản sẽ đưa nước tiểu từ bể thận xuống bàng quang. Và ở phía sau xương mù, phía dưới vùng viên trọng. The bladder store urine, releases urine micturition. Bàng quang là nơi chứa nước tiểu và thải ra trong quá trình đi tiểu, khi đi tiểu, micturition. Sympathetic nerves cause detrusor relaxation and bladder neck contraction to prevent urination. Dây thần kinh giao cảm sẽ làm giãn cơ detrusor và co cổ bàng quang, nhập ngăn sẽ tiểu. Somatic motor fibers from S2 to S4 innervate the external sphincter via the pelvic plexus or pudendal nerve. Cái dây thần kinh vận động thân thể từ S2 đến S4 sẽ chi phối cái cơ thắt ngoài external sphincter thông qua đám gói chậu và thần kinh thẹn. Afferent impulses go to the brain cortex, where voluntary control maintains continence until micturition is appropriate. Các xung thần kinh hướng tâm sẽ đi truyền đến vỏ não. Nơi đây sẽ kiểm soát, chủ động, giúp duy trì cái việc nhịn tiểu, continence, urinary continence, nhịn tiểu cho đến khi thích hợp. Parasympathetic nerve from S2, S4 promote micturition by stimulating it, detrusor contraction. Và các dây thần kinh phối giao cảm từ S2 tới S4 sẽ kích thích cơ detrusor co bóp để thúc đẩy việc đi tiểu. Micturition has two phases: storage, filling, and voiding urination. Micturition sự đi tiểu sẽ gồm hai giai đoạn: lưu trữ mới là làm đầy và thải ra đưa nước tiểu ra ngoài. During filling, the detrusor membranes allows volume to increase without raising pressure. Trong giai đoạn làm đầy, đổ đầy thì cơ detrusor sẽ giúp bàng quang chứa đầy mà không làm tăng trọng lực nội bàng quang. Stretch receptors signal bladder fullness at around 75% capacity, creating the urge to urinate. Các thụ thể căng trong thành bàng quang sẽ đưa ra tín hiệu làm đầy bàng quang ở khoảng 75%, tạo cảm giác thôi thúc muốn đi tiểu. Micturition starts with voluntary, then relaxation of the pelvic floor and sphincter, followed by the detrusor contraction. Việc đi tiểu sẽ bắt đầu bằng sự giãn cơ sàn trọng và co thắt do có ý thức và phản xạ. Sau đó là sự co cơ detrusor. The Pontine Micturition Center coordinates these events to ensure urine is expelled efficiently. Trung tâm tiểu cầu não sẽ điều phối tất cả những cái hoạt động này, đảm bảo cho nước tiểu được tống ra ngoài bài tiết ra một cách hiệu quả. Intravesical pressure remains higher than urethral pressure during voiding to allow bladder emptying. Áp lực trong bàng quang sẽ cao hơn so với cái áp lực niệu đạo trong khi đi tiểu để mà làm rỗng bàng quang hoàn toàn. Okay, now let's enjoy the two video clips. One is about the ureter's function, definition, and its anatomy, and the other is about the urinary bladder, also its structure and function. Let's apply information.
Lên kế hoạch kỳ nghỉ của bạn với Agoda ngay hôm nay. Đặt mọi sản phẩm.
Hi everyone, it's Matt from CK1 Hub, and in this tutorial we will discuss the ureters. The ureters are a pair of muscular, tubular structures responsible for taking urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder for storage prior to excretion. They are collapsible S-shaped channels, each about 25 centimeters in length. They are widest at the renal pelvis and narrow progressively as they enter the urinary bladder. The lumen of each ureter is lined by a mucosal layer of transitional epithelium that accommodates the increase in pressure when the volume of urine leaving the kidney increases, minimizing the risk of rupturing the ureters. These conduits have several infoldings caused by multiple layers of smooth muscle through the ureteral wall. From a histological perspective, there are two muscular layers in the wall of the ureter, a longitudinal and a circular layer. In the lower segment of the ureters, another longitudinal layer can be found proximal to the bladder. It's interesting to note that urine is propelled along the ureters by peristaltic motions initiated by pacemaker cells in the proximal renal pelvis. So, in vivo, you can tell the difference between the ureters and blood vessels because the ureters have a whitish, non-pulsatile exterior with peristaltic waves. The ureters leave the kidneys posterior to the renal vessels. Both ureters pass inferiorly over the abdominal surface of psoas major, with the genitofemoral nerve behind it and the vessels of the gonad in front. As the right ureter travels towards the bladder, it travels posterior to the duodenum, and further down it is crossed by branches of the superior mesenteric vessels. The left ureter, however, travels laterally to the inferior mesenteric vessels and is subsequently crossed by its branches. Eventually, the vessels leave the psoas major as the common iliac arteries bifurcate to enter the true pelvis. The ureter pierces through the wall of the urinary bladder from lateral to medial and posterior to anterior. So, this entrance is oblique. It forms the orifice of the ureter in the urinary bladder at the ureterovesicular junction. The ureters have an expansive anastomosing network of arterial supply and venous drainage along their length. The proximal end receives arterial supply from the ureteric branch of the renal artery, seen here highlighted in green. Contributions from the ovarian artery in females, testicular artery in males, as well as a direct ureteric branch from the abdominal aorta supply the middle segment. The distal portion receives its arterial supply from ureteric branches from both the superior and inferior vesical arteries. They are drained by accompanying veins. Neuronal supply to the ureters comes from both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. T10L1 provides sympathetic innervation via the renal plexus and ganglia. renal and upper ureteric branches from the intermesenteric plexus proximally, and the middle ureteric branch of the intermesenteric plexus in the middle segment. In the true pelvis, the ureter receives parasympathetic supply from the pelvic splanchnic nerves, which are seen here highlighted in green on this image of the female pelvis, and from the inferior hypogastric plexus. These innervations are not pertinent to the generation and maintenance of peristaltic action along the ureters, as this arises from pacemaker cells in the renal pelvis and calyces, as mentioned earlier. However, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are capable of increasing ureteric peristalsis. The lymphatic drainage of the ureters is similar to that of the kidneys. Most of the nodes are named relative to the segment of the aorta they travel adjacent to. Distally, they drain to the internal and external iliac nodes. The middle segment drains to the common iliac and precaval nodes. Proximally, they drain to the lumbar, lateral aortic, and precaval nodes. From there, lymphatic fluid travels to the cisterna chyli and thoracic duct before returning to systemic circulation. This video is more fun than reading a textbook, right? If you want more videos, interactive quizzes,
from KenHub, and in this tutorial we're going to look at the urinary bladder, its function, structure, location, and neurovasculature. So we're going to start off by looking at some sagittalish sections of the infraperitoneal area, with our female model on the left here and our male model on the right. And of course our bladder is highlighted in both images in green. So the urinary bladder is a hollow, muscular, distensible organ of the urogenital system, and it's located inferior to the peritoneum within the lesser pelvis and rests on the pelvic floor. And in this image of the female we can see the bladder over here, the uterus here, the ovaries here, and the rectum here. And over on our male model, we can see our bladder in green, the seminal ducts, and the rectum just here. And so the bladder's main function is to collect urine that's to be later voided by urination. And although the volume of the bladder varies from person to person, in general it can hold anywhere from 400 to 1000 milliliters of urine, with the average capacity at around 400 to 600 milliliters. And so roughly about the same volume as a can of soft drink. So the walls of the bladder are composed of thick, smooth muscle called detrusor muscle, and this muscle is lined with a transitional epithelium internally, which in the bladder is called urothelium. And urothelium is a little bit special, as it also lines the ureters and parts of the ureter, and is also known for its high elasticity. So the body of the urinary bladder, shown here in a male pelvis on top and in a female pelvis below, is the portion of the bladder situated between the fundus and the apex. And the fundus being the inferior posterior surface or base, while the apex is the anterior aspect, which is located towards the pubic symphysis. So this of course is a coronal section of the bladder, but if we were to imagine a sagittal section, then the apex would be up front closest to us, coming out of the screen, near the pubic symphysis, and the fundus would be out the back going into the screen. Urine that comes into the bladder from the kidneys via the ureters is collected in the body of the bladder, and as the bladder fills with urine, it takes an ovoid shape and extends towards the anterior abdominal wall within the greater pelvis. The fundus of the bladder is the inferior part of the posterior wall, or the base of the bladder. And again, we're looking at a coronal section, but just imagine the green section just pointing out into the computer out back. And in males, the fundus is closely related to the anterior wall of the rectum, while in females, the fundus is closely related to the anterior wall of the vagina. And the fundus contains the trigone of the bladder, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. The trigone of the bladder is found on the internal surface of the fundus, and it's an upside-down triangular area of smooth muscle with its superolateral angles formed by the ureteric orifices, which we can see pointed out by these arrows. And these orifices are the openings of the two ureters in the bladder, and between them lies a membranous fold called the interureteral fold. And the interureteral fold is a fold of mucous membrane which has several other names, and these are Mercier's bar, the interureteric fold, or the interureteric crest. So the neck of the bladder is situated at the base of the trigone and is therefore the most inferior aspect of the bladder. Inferiorly, the neck of the bladder is continuous with the proximal urethra. And the urethra, which arises from the neck of the urinary bladder, is a canal for the transportation of urine from the bladder to the external urethral orifice, where urine exits the body. And here we have, of course, our cross-section of the female bladder on the left, and the male bladder and the urethra cross-section on the right. The female urethra is approximately 4 centimeters long, with its external opening situated between the clitoris and the vagina, while the male urethra is much longer and can be divided into 4 parts. The pre-prostatic urethra, which is the initial part of the urethra, and is only about 0.5 to 1.5 centimeters long, and is continuous with the neck of the bladder, which is just here. It's also surrounded by an involuntary muscle called the internal urethral sphincter muscle. The prostatic urethra, which is about 3 to 4 centimeters long, is continuous with the pre-prostatic urethra, and as we can see, it runs through the length of the prostate. The membranous urethra begins upon exiting the prostate, and it's about 1 to 1.5 centimeters long, and it is surrounded by the external urethral sphincter muscle. And here we have the spongy urethra, also referred to as the penile urethra. And the spongy urethra is the final portion of the male urethra, and it's continuous with the membranous urethra. And this part of the male urethra is the longest, about 15 centimeters, and contains the external urethral orifice. And of course we can't leave without talking about the blood supply. So the urinary bladder receives arterial blood supply from 2 branches of the internal iliac artery in both males and females. The superior vesical artery, which supplies the anterosuperior aspect of the bladder, and the inferior vesical artery, which supplies the fundus and the neck of the bladder. Venous blood from the bladder is drained via the vesical venous plexus to the internal iliac veins, and the veins covering the bladder, which are shown in blue in both images, are part of the vesical venous plexus. Innervation of the urinary bladder is provided by the vesical nervous plexus, highlighted in green in both images. So it's probably a good point in our tutorial here to mention the way urine is passed, and which is otherwise known as the process of micturition, as there are 2 ways that this can happen: via a parasympathetic or reflex action called the micturition reflex, or voluntarily through the sympathetic system. So in the case of the micturition reflex, as we've mentioned, the bladder can fill up to around about 400 to 600 milliliters of liquid. So when the bladder is full, it triggers stretch receptors located in the bladder wall. And this occurs around 300 to 400 milliliters of liquid, although at 150 mils it can cause an urge, which is easily repressed. Now, once the bladder triggers the spinal nerves in the parasympathetic nervous system, the detrusor muscle is given the signal to contract, and the bladder expels urine through the urethra. With regards to voluntary micturition, however, motor control is provided by fibers from both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, but greater detail of this process will be covered in another tutorial. What will be useful to remember in this tutorial, however, is that the process of storing liquid and emptying the bladder are under the control of the sympathetic, parasympathetic and somatic nervous systems, with storage controlled by the sympathetic system and micturition controlled by the parasympathetic system. This video is more fun than reading a textbook, right?